Imagine a massive hangar built for bombers, designed to hold dozens of aircraft, now standing empty. Nothing but wind blowing through broken windows while grass sprouts through the concrete floor. Imagine a ballistic missile silo, once capable of wiping out an entire city, now home to bats and local teenage urban explorers. Imagine a radar station that was supposed to give a few minutes warning of a nuclear strike, and today is just a giant rusting structure in the middle of a forest. Places like this exist on every continent. They were built in eras when the world teetered on the edge of war: World War II, the Cold War, regional conflicts. Billions of dollars, thousands of hands, the best engineers of their time, all poured into facilities meant to stand forever. But wars end, politics shift, technology becomes obsolete, and one day, someone gives the order, close the base. And that's when things get interesting. What actually happens to a military installation once the people guarding it are gone? In this video, we'll travel across 3 continents. We'll look at what happened to abandoned bases in Ukraine, in the United States, and in Europe. We'll find out why some became tourist attractions, others became havens for looters and urban explorers, and still others simply vanished from the face of the earth as if they'd never existed. Let's get into it. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991, Ukraine instantly became one of the most heavily militarized countries in the world. Enormous infrastructure remained on its territory: strategic aviation airfields, silo launchers for intercontinental ballistic missiles, underground command posts, ammunition depots, training grounds. By various estimates, in the early 1990s, Ukraine hosted over 700,000 military personnel and equipment that the economy of a newly independent state simply could not sustain. The next 30 years became a story of this legacy gradually fading away. Some equipment was sold, some was scrapped under international disarmament programs, and some bases were simply abandoned because there was neither the money nor the purpose to maintain them. One of the best-known examples is the former 46th Rocket Division of the Strategic Rocket Forces at Pervomaisk. Silo launchers for intercontinental ballistic missiles, the RS-18 and RS-22, capable of carrying nuclear warheads, once stood here. After Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons under the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, the silos began to be dismantled under the American Nunlugar program. Today, one of the silos has been turned into a museum of the strategic missile forces. Visitors can descend dozens of meters underground and see the command post from which, in theory, a nuclear exchange could have begun. But that's the exception. Most of the division's other sites, dozens of silos scattered across the steppe, are simply mothballed. Concrete lids, barbed wire fencing, and complete silence. For decades, locals have told journalists there's an oppressive atmosphere around the former positions, as if the land remembers what was once stored there. Another example is the airfields that once hosted heavy bombers, the Tu-160 and Tu-95 MS, capable of carrying nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Ukraine handed over part of this fleet to Russia in exchange for the write-off of gas debts under agreements from 1999 to 2000, and scrapped the rest. What remained were the hangars, runways, and underground fuel storage facilities. For many years, these sites stood half-empty. Enormous concrete structures built to hold dozens of aircraft were used, at best, at 10% of capacity. That a separate chapter is the abandoned ammunition depots that periodically made headlines for fires and explosions. Novobodanivka, Balaklia, Ichnia, Kalinivka. These sites were built back in Soviet times to store millions of tons of shells, and after decades of poor maintenance, they became not a picturesque ruin for urban explorers, but a genuine hazard for nearby towns. An explosion at such a depot could halt rail traffic for days and force the evacuation of tens of thousands of people. Everything described above is the peacetime story of the decline of Soviet military heritage. But since 2014, and especially since February 2022, the situation has changed fundamentally. Some abandoned and mothballed sites suddenly became relevant again. Old airfields were restored, sealed hangars were repaired, and former training grounds were turned into training centers for new units. At the same time, a new wave of abandoned bases has emerged, this time as a result of combat operations. Facilities in temporarily occupied territories, destroyed air bases, obliterated depots. This is a different, far more tragic chapter, which we're deliberately leaving outside the scope of this video, as it deserves a separate, more careful treatment. The main takeaway from the Ukrainian section is this: an abandoned base here isn't always abandoned forever. A facility that seemed dead for decades can come back to life within weeks if circumstances demand it. This is what fundamentally sets the Ukrainian situation apart from the American and European ones, which we'll turn to next. The United States takes a completely different approach to closed bases. Here, there's even an official bureaucratic mechanism, the BRAC program, Base Realignment and Closure, a commission that repeatedly, in 1988, 1991, 1993, 1995, and 2005, reviewed the network of military installations across the country and decided which ones the Pentagon no longer needed. This is a fundamentally different logic from the post-Soviet one. A base isn't abandoned chaotically due to lack of funds, but closed systematically by commission decision, with a plan for the land's future use. That a classic example is Fort Ord on the California coast, a massive infantry training base that, since World War II, trained millions of soldiers. It was closed under BRAC in 1991. What happened next? Part of the land became the campus of California State University Monterey Bay. Part became a national monument and recreation area with scenic coastal trails, and part was simply left abandoned. Old barracks slowly crumbling, with broken windows and graffiti on the walls, became a favorite spot for photographers chasing the aesthetics of urban decay. The U.S. has a phenomenon that barely exists anywhere else in the world: massive open-air military equipment storage bases in the desert. The most famous is Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, where thousands of retired aircraft, from bombers to transports, sit across thousands of hectares. The dry desert climate preserves the metal almost perfectly, so equipment can wait for decades, either for scrapping or for a possible return to service if ever needed. This isn't exactly abandoned in the classic sense. It's actively guarded and maintained, but visually it creates the impression of a giant graveyard of military might. A more interesting example of genuine abandonment is the launch sites of Nike missiles, which in the 1950s, 60s ringed major American cities as an air defense system against a possible Soviet bomber raid. Once intercontinental ballistic missiles appeared, against which Nike missiles were useless, hundreds of these sites were closed within just a few years, in the early 1970s. Most were demolished or converted for civilian use, but dozens still stand abandoned. Underground bunkers for storing missiles, surrounded by forest or already swallowed by suburban development. Some history enthusiasts find them literally underground, beneath an ordinary park where people walk their dogs, never suspecting that nuclear warheads were once stored beneath their feet. The most distinctive feature of the American approach is commercialization. A closed base here is rarely simply abandoned to rot for decades. Land is too expensive and the bureaucratic machine too efficient to let an asset just decay. Former airbases become civilian airports, as with part of the former Norton Air Force Base in California, industrial parks, prisons, even film studios. The former Hunters Point base in San Francisco became the subject of years-long legal disputes over radioactive contamination dating back to nuclear weapons testing. And this shows the flip side of the coin. American efficiency doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes a closed base leaves behind a toxic legacy that a city fights for decades. So the American model is mostly a fast, pragmatic second life for a facility, either money or a museum or a new residential neighborhood. True dead zones, like those in Europe or Ukraine, are relatively rare here, except where contamination makes the land unfit for reuse. Europe is perhaps the continent richest in abandoned military sites because several historical layers overlap here. World War II, then the division of the continent by the Iron Curtain, then the fall of that curtain and the withdrawal of Soviet troops in the 1990s. Each of these layers left behind tens of thousands of facilities. After German reunification in 1990 and the withdrawal of the group of Soviet forces over the following 4 years, more than 1 million hectares of former military land remained on the territory of the former GDR, hundreds of garrisons, airfields, and training grounds. The withdrawal happened so fast and chaotically that Soviet troops often simply left equipment and property exactly where it stood. The most famous example is Oranienburg Airfield and dozens of similar air bases, where you can still find abandoned hangars with Soviet markings, decaying barracks with Cyrillic writing on the walls, and even personal belongings of soldiers, letters, photographs, left behind as if the people had stepped out for a minute and never returned. The eeriest example is Wunsdorf military town, which in Soviet times was the headquarters of the group of Soviet forces in Germany, an entire underground city of bunkers built to withstand a nuclear strike. After 1994, part of Wunsdorf was converted into housing, but much of it, including the underground structures, still stands abandoned, and it's one of the favorite spots for urban explorers from across Europe. An even older layer is the fortifications Nazi Germany built along the coasts of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands during World War II, the so-called Atlantic Wall. Thousands of concrete bunkers still stand on the beaches of Normandy and other coastlines. Some turned into museums commemorating D-Day, others half buried in sand, swallowed by nature, with tourists stumbling upon them by accident during a walk along the shore. Under the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet Union's satellite states, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, also built secret facilities for nuclear-armed missiles. The most famous is probably the Podborsko complex in Poland, a secret site officially said to store conventional ammunition, but which, as it turned out in the 2000s, actually stored nuclear warheads for missiles deployed in Poland under the strict control of Soviet officers, information the Polish leadership itself didn't fully have. Today, it's an abandoned site gradually being opened up to researchers, and each new discovery becomes a sensation in the Polish media that it's not only the former socialist bloc that has its ghosts. In the United Kingdom, dozens of abandoned Royal Air Force airfields from World War II are scattered across the country, some converted into civilian aviation or industrial parks, others simply overgrown with grass, where only the shape of the field from above hints that fighter planes once took off there. In France, there are the abandoned forts of the Maginot Line, a massive system of fortifications on the border with Germany meant to stop a German invasion in 1940, but which proved strategically useless since the Germans simply went around it through Belgium. Today, some of the forts are museums, while others are abandoned underground labyrinths, entered only by the most daring explorers with flashlights. The overall conclusion from the European section: here, an abandoned base most often becomes either a memorial museum, treated with a distinctly European, restrained respect for history, or an object for the urban exploration subculture. People who photograph decay for the sake of decay itself, searching for beauty in ruin. Why are millions of people around the world so captivated by abandoned military bases? Psychologists who study the phenomenon of urban exploration say it comes down to several things at once. First, there's the sense of access to the forbidden. For decades, these were among the most secretive places on the map, somewhere an ordinary person couldn't get anywhere near. Now you can just walk in. Second, there's the aesthetic of quiet apocalypse. Nature slowly swallowing concrete and metal, trees growing through the floor of a hangar, moss covering a command post from which a nuclear strike order might once have been given. It's a vivid demonstration of just how temporary any human power really is. And third, it's simply living history without a museum filter. In an abandoned base, there's no tour guide and no glass display case. There are real traces of the people who once lived and served there. Letters left behind, numbers scrawled on barracks walls, decaying political training manuals. It hits far harder emotionally than any museum plaque ever could. Before we wrap up, it's worth stepping outside the strict Ukraine, USA, Europe frame for a moment, because some of the most fascinating abandoned military sites in the world don't fit neatly into any of those three baskets. And looking at them helps answer a bigger question. What actually happens to a base in the long run, decades after the last soldier locks the gate during World War II? The United States and Japan built an entire chain of airstrips, fuel depots, and gun emplacements across tiny Pacific atolls, places like Wake Island, Peleliu, and dozens of others most people have never heard of. These islands were fought over at an enormous human cost, and then, almost overnight, became strategically irrelevant once the war ended and air power evolved. Today, many of these atolls are essentially open-air museums nobody curates. Rusting anti-aircraft guns half buried in sand, concrete pillboxes with palm trees growing straight through the gun slits, and coral reefs slowly swallowing sunken landing craft just offshore. Because these islands are so remote, nature has had 70-plus years with almost no human interference, which makes them some of the best preserved time capsules of World War II military engineering anywhere on Earth. Few people realize that Southern Africa had its own Cold War proxy conflicts and its own network of hardened military infrastructure. In the 1980s, apartheid-era South Africa built underground command bunkers and even a secret nuclear weapons program at a facility called Advina, near Pretoria. When the apartheid government dismantled its nuclear arsenal in the early 1990s, the only country in history to voluntarily give up nuclear weapons it had already built, much of that infrastructure was decommissioned. Some of it is now open to researchers as a case study in denuclearization. Other bunkers simply sit sealed, still classified enough that even historians aren't entirely sure what's inside. If Eastern Europe saw a fast, chaotic Soviet withdrawal, the Russian Far East saw almost no withdrawal at all. The empire simply contracted inward and left everything east of a certain line to rot in place. Submarine bases along the Kamchatka coast, radar installations on the Chukotka Peninsula, Entire garrison towns built for tens of thousands of people now house a few hundred, if anyone at all. Photographers who've gained rare access describe apartment blocks with furniture still inside, swimming pools filled with ice instead of water, and rusting submarines listing at their moorings, slowly sinking into harbors nobody dredges anymore. It's less a single dramatic ruin and more a slow-motion abandonment of an entire regional economy that was built around military purpose and never had anything to replace it. Looking across all these examples, Ukraine, the US, Europe, and these outliers, a pattern emerges. Whether an abandoned base gets a second life usually comes down to three factors: location, contamination, and politics. Location matters most. A base near a growing city, like Fort or near the booming Monterey Bay area, will almost always get redeveloped because the land is simply too valuable to leave empty. A base in the middle of nowhere, like a missile silo in the Ukrainian steppe or a bunker in the Russian Far East, has far less economic pressure pushing anyone to touch it, so it just sits. Contamination is the second filter. Sites used for fuel storage, weapons testing, or anything nuclear adjacent often carry environmental cleanup costs that can run into the billions, which is exactly why places like Hunters Point in San Francisco stayed frozen in legal and environmental limbo for so long. Nobody wants to inherit a cleanup bill bigger than the value of the land itself. And politics is the wild card, the factor that can override both of the others in a matter of weeks, as Ukraine has shown since 2022. A base that logic says should stay abandoned forever can suddenly become the most important piece of real estate in the country if the security situation demands it. If this video has made you want to go find one of these places yourself, a quick word of caution is worth including here. Many abandoned military sites, especially anything built after the 1940s, can still contain unexploded ordnance, asbestos, lead paint, or structurally unsound floors and stairwells hidden under decades of debris. In several countries, including Ukraine and Poland, entering a former military site without authorization is also a criminal offense, not just a trespassing technicality, because some of these locations are still technically state secrets or sit near active infrastructure. The safest way to experience almost everything described in this video is through the handful of sites that have been properly converted into museums, with marked paths, cleared ordnance, and someone who actually knows what's structurally safe to walk on. Abandoned military bases are, perhaps, the best physical trace of just how quickly the world can change. Yesterday, this was the front line of a nation's defense. Thousands of people, the most advanced technology of its era. Today, silence, rust, and grass pushing through concrete. Ukraine, the US, Europe. Each of these three parts of the world handles its military heritage in its own way. Some turn it into a museum, some into a business, some simply let it rot, and some, as we're witnessing right now in Ukraine, suddenly have to bring back to life what once seemed dead forever. If you found this interesting, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments which specific abandoned base you'd like us to investigate next. Maybe your idea will become the topic of our next video. See you next time.